He called me a freeloader in front of 100 people. He raised his glass, looked me straight in the eyes, and said that word with a smile, as if it were a compliment. The room froze for a fraction of a second, then burst into laughter. My fiancé stared into his plate, and I sat there with my back perfectly straight, thinking only one thing. He has no idea who paid for this entire celebration. Every glass, every plate, every floral arrangement on the tables. All of it my money. And exactly 48 hours from now, he will find out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Daniel and I met in March 2.5 years ago. I had just been promoted at a consulting firm, moved into a new apartment in downtown Boston, and felt as if life had finally settled onto the right tracks. Daniel worked as an architect in a small studio, intelligent, attentive, with hands accustomed to pencil and ruler, and the gaze of someone who can see structure where others see only surface. We ran into each other at an urban planning conference. I was presenting on behalf of my company. He was there as a guest expert. After my talk, he came up and said I had 3 errors in my slides with the numbers. I replied that he had misunderstood the methodology. We argued all the way until the conference hall closed, then continued at a cafe across the street, and then another 3 hours outside despite the March wind. The first months were exactly like that: conversations, debates, walks through the city we saw in completely different ways. He saw it architecturally, I saw it economically. Daniel would bring me coffee in the mornings if he stayed over. Always just right, with milk and no sugar, even though I had never told him the proportions. He remembered on his own. On Sundays we would go to the farmer's market. He would choose cheese, I would pick greens, and it all felt so natural, as if we had been rehearsing this life for years before we met. I knew his family was different. Daniel once mentioned in passing, "My father is the kind of man who believes a man should earn more than a woman. It's not even a belief, it's a reflex for him." I didn't give it much thought. Everyone has parents with their own quirks. That doesn't say anything about the person themselves. Daniel was different. He never spoke about money in terms of who earns more or less. When we traveled, sometimes he paid, sometimes I did, and it was never a topic. I met Daniel's family for the first time at Christmas, 8 months after we met. His parents lived in the suburbs, in a large house with a lawn and an American flag by the porch. His father, Ronald, greeted me with a firm handshake and a look that immediately felt evaluative. Not hostile but not warm either. As if I were being weighed and the result had not yet been announced. His mother, Patty, was emphatically welcoming. Too emphatic, with that particular kind of politeness that sometimes hides something else. There was also Daniel's sister, Carrie, pleasant, slightly absent-minded, clearly living in her father's shadow. At Christmas dinner, Ronald asked what I did. I explained strategic consulting, working with corporate clients, currently leading several major projects. He nodded as if I had listed hobbies. "And Daniel said you rent an apartment?" he asked next. I said yes, downtown. "I see," he said, and turned back to a conversation with his son about a football game. That "I see" stung, just a little, like a splinter you don't immediately remove because you think it will go away on its own. I told myself he was just a man of another generation, another mindset, and that what mattered was how Daniel treated me, not his father. I finished my wine, smiled at Patty, and forgot about it. Or thought I had forgotten it. Daniel proposed to me in November, in that very same coffee shop where we had accidentally met for the second time after the conference. It was simple, without theatrics. He placed the ring on the table, said a few words that were honest and precise, without unnecessary elaboration. It was very much like him. I said yes before he even finished speaking. The ring turned out to be exactly the kind I would have chosen myself, thin with a single stone, without Baroque excess. Wedding planning began in January. That was when everything truly started. The first thing that made me uneasy was not a word or an action. It was the tone. The 3 of us were sitting together, I, Daniel, and his parents, at a Sunday lunch, discussing the date and the venue. I suggested several options, explaining the reasoning behind each. Ronald listened, then turned to his son and said, "Dan, what do you think?" As if I wasn't even at the table. Daniel replied something, and the conversation continued between them. I took a sip of water and told myself, fine. He's just used to speaking to his son like that. Then there was the budget situation. Daniel was upfront from the start. His parents were willing to contribute a certain amount, but that amount was modest. For the scale we were discussing, I didn't object. I had savings I earned well, and if I wanted a wedding in a particular format, I was ready to pay for it. Daniel and I discussed it privately. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. He thanked me, and it was clear it wasn't easy for him, accepting that the bride would be paying more than his family. But he accepted it. I appreciated that. What I didn't expect was that his parents didn't know. Daniel didn't tell them how the budget was being split. I asked him about it once gently. He said, "Dad would be offended if he found out. Better not bring it up." I didn't push. It felt like his family dynamic, not my place to interfere. Let him deal with his father himself. But it was precisely Daniel's silence that became the first real brick in the wall that would eventually collapse on both of us. The next few months were hectic and generally happy. I booked the venue. A country hotel with a garden capacity of 120 guests, good cuisine, beautiful views. I chose the catering, floristry, a band, a photographer. Each time I signed contracts. Each time I transferred deposits. Patty sometimes came to look at flower samples or taste menus, and that was pleasant. She had an eye for detail and good taste in certain things. Ronald didn't get involved in the planning, which I considered a good sign. One moment stuck in my memory, although I didn't give it much weight at the time. Patty and I were sitting in the florist's office, going through catalogs. She picked up a sample lush peonies in a creamy pink palette, and said, "Beautiful. Probably expensive, right?" I said yes, a bit, but I like them. She looked at me with a strange expression. Not disapproval, something else. Almost pity. "You know how to spend money," she said quietly. I laughed, thinking it was a compliment. Later I remembered that phrase several times, and each time I heard something different in it. The conflict broke out 3 weeks before the wedding. We met at Daniel's parents' house to discuss final details. Seating arrangements, speeches, the order of the ceremony. Everything was going fine until I showed the final budget breakdown. Ronald took the sheet, looked at the total amount, and raised his eyes to me. "And who is paying for all this?" he asked in a tone usually used when talking about someone else's irresponsibility. I replied calmly, "Most of it me, and the rest from a joint budget Daniel and I had agreed on." A pause fell. Ronald looked at his son. Daniel was studying the tablecloth. "So my son is allowing his fiancée to pay for her own wedding," Ronald said slowly, as if choosing his words. Not a question, a statement. There was something like contempt in his tone, toward me or toward his son, I couldn't tell. Daniel finally looked up. "Dad, we decided this together." "Together?" Ronald repeated with a strange laugh. "It's clear who's doing the deciding here." I felt something tighten under my ribs. Not hurt, but a bad premonition. It was a moment when I should have said something directly. But I stayed silent. Daniel stayed silent. Patty offered tea. The conversation shifted to seating arrangements, and I convinced myself everything was fine. Just an old-school man, just an awkward moment. Exactly 3 days later, Patty called me with a request. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Olivia, dear, we've run into a small situation." It turned out they wanted to invite additional guests, 18 more people, colleagues of Ronald and old family friends who it would be awkward not to invite. When I asked who would be paying for those 18 extra seats, Patty said they would of course reimburse it later. "We're family, Olivia." That was the exact phrase. I said I would think about it and called Daniel. He said he didn't know anything about his father's decision. At least, that was what he claimed. I asked whether he could refuse them. He paused and said, "That's my dad. He's difficult." I realized there would be 18 people spending my money. I spoke with the venue, paid extra to expand the guest list. I did it without talking to Ronald, without objections, just closed the issue and moved on. Probably that was the mistake. Not a financial one, a human one. Because my lack of protest was taken as permission. The wedding day started early and beautifully. A June morning, cool and clear, the smell of freshly cut grass across the hotel grounds. My friend Sarah arrived at 6 a.m. with coffee and bagels, and we sat on the balcony of the room until the preparations began. Just talking, the way people who have known each other for 20 years can talk. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Yes," I answered. And it was true back then, it was true. The ceremony went well. Daniel stood under an arch of white roses, the very roses I had chosen with the florist 3 months earlier, and looked at me in a way that made me almost forget everything else. Almost. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Ronald whispering something to Patty while the priest read the text. What it was, I found out later. The reception began at 6:30. The hall was exactly how I wanted it. Peonies in tall vases, warm lighting, long tables instead of round ones, a light jazz band in the corner. Guests were seated, waiters served the first course. Everything was going as it should. The speeches began after the main course. The first to speak was Daniel's father. Ronald rose slowly. A man used to everyone falling silent when he stands. He really knew how to command a pause. He lifted his glass, looked around the room, smiled wide, confident, the smile of a man in control, practiced over years. My son chose a woman with ambition, he began, and even in that tone there was something that made me shift slightly in my seat. Olivia is a business-minded girl, good at managing resources, hers and others. The room laughed, some guests not understanding the subtext, others sensing it. They say that in the modern world it doesn't matter who earns more in a household. I am an old-school man, I'll be honest. It matters to me. But since my son enjoys living with such a enterprising freeloader, well. He paused, scanned the room. To the newlyweds. That word, freeloader, fell into the room like a stone into still water. The ripples spread instantly. Someone choked. Someone looked away. Someone laughed nervously, unsure how to react. I sat completely still. Hands on my lap. Glass untouched. My face steady because I didn't allow it to be anything else. Daniel beside me said nothing. He didn't stand. Didn't object. Took his glass and drank. That, his silence, hurt more than his father's words. I remember the smell. Apple cider vinegar from the salad dressing in front of me. I remember a chair creaking behind a neighboring table. I remember Sarah looking at me across the table with a sharp, worried gaze of someone who understood everything. I remember my own hands, completely calm on the outside, but inside, somewhere deep in my chest, something was slowly closing, like a hatch being sealed. The banquet continued. Guests danced. The photographer took pictures. I smiled, danced, said the right things at the right moments. I can function in a mode where you have to keep up appearances. That's a skill that comes after years in consulting. But beneath the surface, something was happening. Around midnight, when guests began to leave, Ronald approached me, alone without Patty. He extended his hand, gave me the same handshake as at our first meeting. Nice party, he said, as if it were a compliment. I looked him in the eyes calmly without anger. Yes, I replied. It was. He didn't catch the subtext. He walked to his car. Sarah found me on the terrace around 1 in the morning. I was standing by the railing looking at the garden. She stood beside me in silence. We didn't speak for several minutes. Then she quietly asked, "Are you okay?" I thought for a second. "No," I said. "But I will be." At night, already in the room while Daniel was asleep, I lay on my back staring at the ceiling. The word was still ringing in my ears, and my husband's silence next to it. I took out my phone and, in the glow of the screen, began methodically scrolling through correspondence with vendors, the venue, catering, florist, photographer, musicians, decorator. All contracts were in my name. All deposits were paid from my card. The total amount I had spent on this evening shimmered in the expense table, large, concrete, completely unambiguous. I closed the phone, closed my eyes, and made the first of the decisions that changed everything. In the morning, Daniel woke up before me. I heard him order coffee to the room, open his laptop. When I came out of the bathroom, he looked at me with a guilty expression, the kind a person has when they know they should have done something and didn't. "Olivia," he began. "Not now," I said. "I want to talk," he continued. "I know," I replied. "But not now." We ate breakfast almost in silence. Then we drove home. I needed time not to calm down. I needed to think clearly without emotions interfering. On Monday I called Michael. Michael is my colleague, but more importantly, a person who used to work as a corporate lawyer before moving into consulting and still knows all the right people. I asked him to recommend a good family lawyer. He didn't ask why. Something in my voice apparently made the question unnecessary. He sent a contact within 15 minutes. The lawyer's name was Helen Chun. Her office was in the business district on the 3rd floor. A pleasant room overlooking the street. She listened to me carefully, without interrupting, making short notes. Then she asked a few specific questions. About the prenuptial agreement, we hadn't signed one. About financial documentation, I had everything. About joint property, there was almost none. We had only just begun building a shared life. Helen looked at my printed contracts and said calmly, "You have a strong position." I didn't ask in what sense. I already knew. Daniel noticed that something had changed 3 days later. I was still living with him, still behaving normally, but he had grown used to reading me well. "You're not angry," he said one evening. "That's worse than if you were." I asked him why he thought so. "Because when you're angry, it's understandable. But now you are making a decision." I didn't respond. He was right. We had our first real confrontation on Friday. I set the table for dinner, ordinary weekday without any pretense. When we sat down, I placed a sheet of paper in front of Daniel. He looked at it, then raised his eyes. "What is this?" "A financial report. About the wedding. With a breakdown." He took the page. I gave him time to read it. It listed every item. Venue rental. Catering for 120 guests. Extra charges for 18 additional seats, those his father had added. Florist. Musicians. Photographer. Decor. Transport. At the end was the total sum in a breakdown table. What was mine, what was shared, what came from his family. The last column was the smallest. "Olivia," Daniel said quietly, "I just want you to see the numbers," I replied. "Not as an accusation. As a fact. I know these numbers." "You do." I looked at him steadily. "Then tell me. Does your father know them?" Silence. Daniel set the sheet down. Rubbed his face with his hand. "No," he said finally. "Why?" I already explained. He called me a freeloader in front of 100 people, Daniel. I said it without raising my voice. Just stating it. In front of 100 people who now think your family paid for this wedding. And you said nothing. Silence. It was very long. A car passed outside. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. Daniel stared at the sheet in front of him, and I could see his jaw working. "I should have stopped him," he said at last. "Yes. I was thrown off. I know. That's not an excuse." "No." Another pause. I poured a glass of water and placed it in front of him. He didn't take it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Nothing from you," I replied. "I want to talk to your father." "Myself." He looked up sharply with concern. "Olivia, that's a bad idea." "Maybe," I agreed. "But it's my decision." Daniel was silent for a while longer. Then he nodded. Once. Briefly. And in that nod there was something, not permission, no. Something like surrender to the fact that he could no longer stop me, because he had lost that right the night he stayed silent. On Saturday, I went to Daniel's parents alone. Ronald was home, tinkering in the garage he had turned into a workshop. Patty peeked out at the sound of the car, saw me, and started to walk toward me. I politely said I needed to speak with Ronald and asked her to give us a minute. She froze, looked past my shoulder toward the road. "All right," she said quietly, and went back into the house. Ronald came out of the garage with a rag in his hands. He had been wiping down a tool. He saw me, narrowed his eyes slightly. "Olivia, isn't Daniel home?" "I know," I said. "I came to see you." He leaned against the garage door frame, relaxed, with that same expression of someone who held the upper hand. "Well? What happened?" I pulled a sheet from the folder, the same one I had placed in front of Daniel, and handed it to him. "This is a financial report on the wedding. I'd like you to read it." He took it with mild surprise and began to read. As he did, his expression changed. Slowly, like lighting shifting when clouds cover the sun. Not abruptly but gradually. He reached the final line. Then the breakdown by funding sources. He looked up. "Where did this come from?" His voice had hardened. "These are contracts with vendors. Receipts. Bank statements. I have the originals. This is a summary sheet." "So what are you saying?" He looked at the paper again. "That my family. Your family contributed 14% of the total budget," I said evenly. "The rest was my money, including the 18 additional guests you asked to add through Patty. I paid for that without question." It's marked there as well. He stood silently. The rag in his hand tightened into a fist. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice a half-tone lower. Now you do. Daniel should have. Yes, I cut him off. He should have. But he didn't say anything. That's between you two. My matter is different. A pause. He looked at the paper, then at me. Why are you showing me this? I looked at him calmly. Because last week you called me a freeloader in front of 100 people. I want you to understand what exactly you said. And about whom. Ronald didn't respond right away. A long pause, the kind that usually leads either to denial or to something more real. I waited. He looked away toward the garden, the lawn. Pressed his lips together. You're right, he said at last, quietly, almost into the air. That was, a pause. Wrong. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't what I might have wanted to hear a year ago, or even a week ago. But it was something. Small, uncomfortable, and honest wrong from a man who it seemed rarely said such things out loud. I nodded, took the sheet back from his hand and put it away in the folder. All right, I said. I'm glad we talked. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I was already turning toward the car. That evening I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The tea went cold. Outside it was quiet. Only somewhere on the neighboring street a dog was barking. I thought about what had happened, not the conversation with Ronald specifically, but something larger. That this wasn't the end of the story. That perhaps everything was only just beginning. Because 3 days later, something I didn't expect happened. Carrie called me, Daniel's sister. We had seen each other at the wedding, exchanged a few words, but were never close. She called my mobile, and there was something tense in her voice. Olivia, do you know what Dad is planning to do? No, I replied. Do you? A pause. He spoke to a lawyer, she said cautiously, about joint assets. He thinks you're going to want a divorce, and he wants Daniel to be protected. I was silent for a second. Carrie, are you telling me this because it's unfair, she interrupted. Her voice trembled. I know Dad isn't always. I saw what happened at the wedding. It was awful. And you don't deserve to have this on top of everything. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat motionless for several minutes. Teacup in my hands, the smell of mint, the low hum of the street outside the window. Then I picked up my phone and wrote to Helen Shun. The meeting with the lawyer was the next morning. I arrived early and sat in the hallway, turning the facts over in my mind. When I went into the office and told her about Carrie's call, Helen wasn't surprised. She made a note. Good, she said. That's useful to know. But let me tell you something important. What you previously described, financial documents from the wedding, contracts, statements, that is your own record. It doesn't fall under marital property. No lawyer can do anything with that. She paused. Unless you choose to do something with it yourself. I asked what she meant. Helen looked at me calmly. You spent a significant amount of money on an event in which his family participated. They were invited as guests to that event. The groom's family's financial contribution was disproportionately small, while they expanded the guest list at your expense. That can be classified. How exactly? She raised an eyebrow slightly. As use of your resources without adequate reciprocal obligation. Legally it's not straightforward, but in negotiations, it's a very strong argument. I didn't want a lawsuit. I didn't want the money back. I needed something else. I needed the truth to become visible, completely without omissions. I explained this to Helen. She nodded. Then you need a different conversation. Not with a lawyer. With people. From the office I drove slowly, through the old quarter with lime trees along the road. The window was open, the air smelled of summer and exhaust fumes. I was thinking about what Carrie had told me, and about the fact that it was Ronald who went to a lawyer. He didn't talk to his son, didn't talk to me, he went to a lawyer. A man who doesn't talk to me is already at war with me. So I was too. Over the next few days I worked methodically. I gathered a full set of financial documents from the wedding, original contracts, bank card statements, receipts from every vendor. I scanned everything and organized it into a folder. I built a timeline. When the contracts were signed, by whom, in whose name, from which account the payments were made. Everything was precise, transparent, undeniable. Each page was like an argument in a case that hadn't started yet, but was already underway. Daniel tried to talk several times during that time. I didn't avoid him. I answered his questions, but I kept a certain distance. Not a cold one, not demonstrative, just the kind that forms between people when one of them already knows more than the other thinks they do. "Have you spoken to Helen?" he asked one evening. "Yes," I said. "And she's a good specialist." He paused. "Olivia, I don't want us to." "Daniel," I interrupted gently, "give me a little time. Just a little." I called Sarah, not to vent but to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I explained everything from the beginning. The toast, Daniel's silence, the conversation with Ronald, Carrie's call, the lawyer. Sarah listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Do you realize you're not crazy? That all of this is really happening?" "I do," I replied. I needed to hear it said out loud. "I confirm it," she said. "And also this. The fact that you're so calm both impresses and scares me." I laughed. For the first time in several days. The moment I had been preparing for arrived on its own, without any staging. Ronald called on Thursday evening. His voice was neutral, almost friendly, the voice of someone who had decided to take back initiative. "Olivia, I think we need to meet. As a family. Talk." "Of course," I replied. "When is convenient for you?" "Sunday at lunch. At our place." "All right," I said. "I'll be there." I hung up and stared at the phone for a few seconds. Then I sent one message to Carrie. Just, "Will you be at your parents' on Sunday?" She replied quickly. "Yes, Dad invited me." "Good," I wrote. "There's something I need your help with." "I'll explain." I spent Sunday morning calmly. I got up at 7, made coffee, went out onto the balcony. The Boston summer smelled like summer cities do on weekend mornings. A little water, a little heated stone, a little something indefinably good. I sat in silence and thought, not about what I would say, but about who I had become over these past weeks. I thought about the girl who had sat at the Christmas table and heard, understood, and brushed it off. About the girl who paid for 18 seats and said nothing. About the girl who sat upright at her own wedding and heard the word freeloader, and still said nothing. Somewhere between that girl and what I was now carrying in my bag, something irreversible had happened. I hadn't become angrier. I hadn't become more vengeful. I had become more precise. In the bag was a folder with documents. And something else too, a small envelope, the contents of which had come into my possession 2 days earlier, when I found time to sit with Carrie over coffee and hear what she knew about the family's finances. She knew a lot. Carrie had lived in that house for 26 years. She had seen things that were meant not to be noticed, and she had stayed silent for so long that she seemed almost relieved to finally stop. When I arrived at Ronald's house, Carrie's car was already parked at the gate. Daniel came with me. Silent, tense, clearly sensing that something was going to happen, but not knowing what. At the table, Ronald and Patty were already seated. Places were set for 5. Ronald stood when we came in. The handshake was firm, familiar. The smile controlled, diplomatic. "I'm glad everyone could make it," he said. "I'm happy we can talk as a family." We sat down. Patty brought coffee. Carrie caught my eye across the table, briefly, questioningly. I gave a small nod. Ronald began speaking, something about the importance of family unity, about how everyone has different perspectives, about how words are sometimes said differently than intended. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. Then I opened the folder. "Ronald," I said, "I want us to talk about the numbers." He frowned slightly. "Olivia, I thought we were here to. We're here to talk honestly." My voice was steady, without challenge, just a fact. For that, we need facts. Here they are. I laid a printed summary sheet on the table, the very same one I had given Ronald by the garage, but now with an additional page. Daniel looked at it and went pale. Patty took the sheet, her hands trembling slightly. Ronald took his copy. "This is the financial documentation for our wedding," I said, "complete with sources. I want everyone in this room to see the same thing." "We discussed this," Ronald said sharply. "You and I, yes." Patting it. Daniel saw it. I looked at Patty. "Did you know how much I contributed?" Patty lowered her gaze. "I thought it was 50-50. Her voice was quiet. "No," I said. Not 50-50. Silence. Ronald put the sheet down on the table. Olivia, where are you going with this? To honesty, I replied. You called me a freeloader in front of 100 people who came to a celebration paid for mostly by me. I want you to understand it not as an insult but as arithmetic. You came here to make a scene, Ronald said, and there was a hardness in his voice that I think usually made people fall silent. No, I answered. If I wanted to make a scene, I would have done it there. In front of 100 guests. Like you did. Silence. Carrie beside me didn't move. Daniel stared at the table. Patty slowly blotted her lips with a napkin. I have something else to show you, I said. I took out an envelope. Inside were 2 sheets. The first Carrie had found in her father's desk drawer a few days earlier, when she was looking for a stapler and came across a printout. A consultation with a family lawyer. Dated 4 days after the wedding. Subject: protecting the son's interests in case of possible divorce. Documenting sources of assets. I placed that sheet on the table. Face up. Ronald looked at it. Then at Carrie. Then back at the page. Something in his face changed completely. Not anger, not surprise. Something more complicated. Carrie, he said quietly. Dad, she replied evenly. She has the right to know. The second sheet was simpler. A bank statement printout. An account opened in Daniel's name. Funded 5 days after the wedding. The amount: 1/3 of what had been contributed to the wedding by the family's side. The source of the transfer: Ronald's account. I didn't know exactly what it meant, precaution, a desire to give his son a financial cushion, something else. But in the context of the legal consultation and the toast at the wedding, it read a certain way. I'm not getting divorced, I said. In case that matters. But I want you to understand this. I am not someone you can ignore. Not someone you can talk about while she is sitting right next to you. And not someone you can live off while believing she means nothing. Ronald looked at me for a long time. I held his gaze calmly without anger. Just looking. Daniel, he finally said. And it was the first time during the entire conversation he addressed his son. Did you know about the consultation? Daniel lifted his head. No, one word. Quiet, conclusive. Ronald pushed the sheet aside. Rubbed the bridge of his nose. A long pause. The kind in which you could hear a car passing outside the window, water dripping from a faucet somewhere. Patty didn't move. Carrie looked at her father with the expression people have when they've been waiting for this moment for a long time. I was wrong, Ronald said. Slowly. Each word like an object placed carefully so it wouldn't break. At the wedding. It was. He hesitated. Unfair. And stupid. Patty let out a quiet breath beside him. Thank you, I said. Not it's okay. Not I'm not upset. Just thank you. Because it wasn't okay and I was upset, and accepting an apology doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. Lunch passed quietly. Not awkwardly, quietly. The kind of quiet conversations that happen when something in a room has changed irreversibly and everyone can feel it, but no one yet knows what it will mean in the long term. Ronald didn't make any big speeches. Patty asked about summer plans cautiously, as if testing the ground. Carrie caught my eye on the way out and gave a slight shrug, with the expression that meant, you made it. On the way home, Daniel was silent for a long time. I was driving, the window slightly open, warm air tousling his hair. Then he said, I should have stopped him at the wedding. Yes, I replied. I'll stop it if anything like that happens again. I know, I said. I paused. And I want you to understand. I didn't do it out of revenge. I wanted the truth to be named. He nodded. Another pause. You're an extraordinary person, Olivia, he said at last. Not as a compliment. As an observation. Slightly astonished, slightly disoriented, entirely honest. I didn't respond. I watched the road. Outside the window, summer trees flashed by. And everything was both worse and better than it had been before the wedding. Worse, because some illusions about the family I had gained hadn't survived those few weeks. Better, because I now knew exactly who I was, what I was worth, and what to do with people who forget that. A few months passed. September brought cool air and the scent of the first fallen leaves. The kind of scent I had always considered the smell of beginnings, although most people associate it with endings. Daniel and I found a rhythm, Not like the one we had in the first 2 years before the wedding, something different. More mature, I suppose. Less naive. With more honesty and fewer topics that are usually left unspoken. At first, after that Sunday lunch, Daniel spoke to his father less often than usual, I noticed, but I didn't ask. That was his responsibility, not mine. Ronald called me in October. Himself. Without warning on a Wednesday evening. I was at home making soup, something with pumpkin and lentils, which Daniel for some reason called Olivia's autumn soup, and asked me to cook whenever possible. I saw his name on the screen and stared at it for a few seconds, then picked up. Olivia. Are you busy? No. I'm listening. Pause. I wanted to ask. How is work going? Daniel said you're leading a big project. Yes, I replied. It's going well. Thank you for asking. Another pause. Good, he said. That's good. And he hung up. This was not a touching reconciliation. It was not the ending of a family film where everyone hugs and cries. It was a phone call from a person who might have been learning to do things differently, slowly, awkwardly, with effort. Maybe it meant something. Maybe not. I didn't build any illusions. Carrie wrote to me on Halloween. Just a funny card with a pumpkin and, hope everything is okay. I replied. We didn't become best friends, but we became people who are not strangers to each other. That is something. Sarah came for the November weekend. We went to that same farmer's market where Daniel used to pick cheeses and I would choose greens. Sarah bought apple cider and quince jam. We walked under a gray November sky, warming our hands on paper cups of something hot, and I told her everything slowly in detail. She listened. You understood something important, she said at the end. What? That the price isn't money. You can earn money back. But what you understood about yourself, that stays forever. I thought about that later. About the price. About how the most expensive things in this story were not the peonies or the catering, not the 18 extra seats that were paid for. The most expensive thing was the lesson that cannot be passed on to anyone else. You can only pay for it yourself. I started driving to work again along the same route I used 2 years ago. Past the park, past the old Lindens, across the bridge. In the morning there is always coffee in the car, proper coffee with milk and no sugar. Sometimes I make it, sometimes Daniel does. It never became a topic. The folder with wedding documents lies in the bottom drawer of the desk, where things are kept that are not needed every day, but should not be thrown away. I don't take it out. I don't need to reread it. I remember every number. At the end of November, while sorting things in the attic, I found a small notebook. The one where I had written down the first ideas for the wedding back in winter. Flowers. Menu. Music. Guest list. First thoughts, light, joyful, full of exclamation marks. I leafed through it and put it back. I didn't throw it away. Because that was me too, the one who believed in lightness. And I don't pity her. I understand her. I just know more now. On a Sunday morning in December we were having breakfast at home. Quietly, with a newspaper and cold coffee. Daniel sat across from me, reading something. Outside the window the first snow was falling, rare, slow, the kind that doesn't settle, just marks the presence of winter. I held my cup and looked outside. Snow was falling. The coffee was warm. The house was quiet. Daniel looked up from the newspaper. Looked at me. Said nothing. I looked back. Also said nothing. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that happen in silence, between people who know each other well enough for silence to be honest rather than dangerous. I finished my coffee. It didn't taste bitter. For the first time in a long while it was simply coffee. Warm, familiar, exactly what was needed right now. Outside the snow kept falling. I was home.